Yeah, for sure. Yeah, well, thank you for having me, first of all, and thank you everybody for showing up. And welcome to Agile in the time of Corona. It's certainly not a talk I thought I'd be giving last year, but here we are, right? Guessing nobody thought we'd be doing these things over Zoom and the like. So things have clearly changed, and we're here to talk a little bit about some of that. So let's get this up into presentation mode. We'll get started. Okay, so a little bit about myself. So my name is Todd Charron. There's my contact information and Twitter information. If you have any questions that don't get answered either throughout the course of this presentation or through the Q&A at the end, then by all means feel free to shoot me an email. Sorry, did I hear somebody there? Okay, well I'll keep going. Okay, for sure. Cool, for sure. And again, like I said, if you have anything afterwards, just feel free to shoot me an email or a tweet. So a little bit about myself. So I got started in Agile way back in about 2005. I started working at a company that was doing extreme programming, and they were doing it very badly, as many organizations were at the time. And I figured that out pretty quick as I started to learn more about it. And around 2008, I got my first experience with the Scrum team, and then around 2010, I started doing Agile and Scrum coaching consulting, which I still do today. And one cool thing I got to do was at the end of last year, I actually was the closing keynote speaker for the Toronto Agile Conference. And at that talk, I kind of gave a little bit of a state of the Agile Union talk, if you will, kind of about where we've come from, where we are, and what that kind of means in the big picture of things. And it was kind of a weird place, that I thought that we were in, and I didn't quite know what was going to come next. And obviously, things have changed dramatically, and we're going to talk a little bit about how that has affected things. So, one thing I want to clarify right off the top is I don't have all the answers, and I don't think that anybody does right now. But it's important for us to start asking these questions and start figuring out where we go from here as we try to adapt into a changing world. So, one concept that I really liked about Agile that really kind of drew me to it was this concept of gravity. This was a term I picked up from Lisa Atkins in her book, Coaching Agile Teams. And she mentioned spotting a bumper sticker on a car that said "Gravity Works." And apparently, it was a slogan for like climbers, mountain climbers, rock climbers, just as a reminder that regardless of what your plans are, gravity is always going to work, and you don't get a say over that. Gravity is going to do what gravity is going to do, and that's the idea that you have to adapt to reality as opposed to attempting to force reality to adapt to you, which was interesting because in software, that's kind of what when we think of traditional waterfall approaches, that's kind of what we were doing at the time. Was we were trying to, we thought if we just gathered all the requirements, the customer would never change their mind if they signed off on it, or if we made the perfect plan, nothing would go wrong because nothing would ever interrupt it, and we just constantly kind of wanted reality to bend to our will. But then on the agile side of things, we said, well, you know what? Reality is going to be reality. So instead of trying to fight it, why don't we just accept it and work in a way that adapts to it? I think that's important, that we have to really always recognize reality. And I think in this reality, we have to recognize that agile as a movement also is constrained by reality. And as we know, every successful movement has its moment, and then every movement ends. And so what this means is that the agile movement is going to end at some point. So a couple of years ago, I kind of had this feeling. I kind of thought, well, maybe things are kind of maybe we're in the later stages of this movement. So I went around to a bunch of open spaces and I started pitching a topic. Agile is dead. Changed my mind, and it was a really interesting experience. I wasn't sure what I was going to get. I was really hoping I was wrong. And expected I would get people that would come up to me and they'd say, hey, I agree with you. Here's why. Or, hey, I disagree with you. Here's why. Maybe you should change your mind. And maybe I would. But that really wasn't what happened. The interesting thing that happened was the most common reaction I got to actually bringing up this topic was, how dare you? Like, you're not even allowed to talk about this stuff, about the possibility that we might be at the end. How dare you do that? Whether it's right or wrong is irrelevant. You're not allowed to talk about this. And to me, that was fascinating. And it was like I had struck a lightning rod or stepped on a third rail, just the electricity that it generated in people in the conversations. So before we get going into this talk, I want to reassure you that it's going to be okay. You can breathe, take a deep breath with me here. No one is coming to steal your agile. You can still have your agile after this, even if the agile movement ends. It's okay. And if someone comes and tries to take it from you, by all means, apparently you can say swipe or no swiper 3 times, and that will stop it from happening. I'm pretty sure that's going to work. Now, the reason I bring this up is because it's important to understand that Agile doesn't have to be your identity, and it doesn't define who you are. You are much more than just Agile. And we didn't actually get into this, or at least I didn't get into this. I didn't get into this to be agile. That wasn't the point. When I discovered agile back in 2005, when I was in that extreme programming shop, it was really how do we find better ways of working, right? Agile was never our goal. It was really to how do we make better organizations? How do we make organizations that are better for the company itself and for its success and its business? How is it better for the people who work in it? How do we, solve some of the problems that we were having with the way that we were working? So let's get back to basics. So in Agile, people often talk about the Agile Manifesto and they talk about the four values and the 12 principles. But I think we forget what to me is the most important part, and that's right in that preamble, right at the beginning. That's that first sentence. The idea that we are uncovering better ways of developing software by doing it and helping others to do it. Like that's a really big part. That's a really powerful sentence because it really defines this movement as being by practitioners for practitioners, a kind of do-it-yourself thing. It wasn't some external consulting company that was going to come in and tell you how to do this. It was just people who were doing the work were frustrated with the way things were going, and they wanted to find a better way, and they wanted to share that better way with other people. But we also have to recognize now that reality has changed. The context of Agile back then, around 2001, is a little different than the context now. And I was, of course, talking about this last year in 2019. The context was different then, and it's way different now in 2020, as I'm sure you've all experienced. So we have to recognize that over time, the Agile knowledge gap grows. So what does this mean when I talk about this? So back in the day when I first got into Agile, I'd go to a meetup group and meet up with people. And the thing was, if you had read these three books, you were pretty good on the game. If you had read Extreme Programming Explained, or Agile Software Development with Scrum, or Lean Software Development, you knew quite a bit about Agile. I mean, there was probably a good chance you were the most expert Agile person in your company if you had just read these three books. Problem is, of course, nowadays somebody comes to me, they say, Todd, I'm interested in this Agile stuff. What book should I read? And it's really hard to say. I mean, if you look at this picture, there's 1 to 16 of over 1,000 agile software development results. Which one do you start with? Where do you go? Do you have to read all of them? I haven't read all of them. I don't know if you've read all of them. I'm pretty sure nobody's read all of them. I'm sure there's some fantastic books in there. But what books do you need and which ones do you have to read? I mean, if you read Agile Software Development with Scrum, will you get that much more out of Scrum, the art of doing work twice the work in half the time, or Software in 30 days, or Essential Scrum, or Succeeding with Agile? Do you have to read all of those books? Or is there a lot of repetition in there? There's no clear answer anymore for what that is. And the reason why this happens is, of course, in the early days, like I said, when I started going to user groups, user groups like this one here, right? There would have been maybe 20 people there if you were lucky. And the people who knew the most there, they knew way more than you, but it wasn't that much more than you. Like if you were brand new showing up to an Agile meetup, within like 6 months to a year, you'd be where that top person was at the time. And it was just kind of the small group of new people coming in and learning from those who were not that much further ahead of them. But what happens is, of course, is over time, more new people come in and more new people. And those people you were learning from, well, they didn't stand still either. They kept learning as well. So they're picking up new knowledge and new knowledge. And as this grows and grows and grows, you get all these new beginners starting from zero. But the people who are there at the beginning, they know way more. So every new thing, every new technique, every new idea that comes out is just one more new idea for them to learn. But if you're starting from zero, instead of having to learn maybe, 5 concepts, 10 concepts, 15 concepts, now it could be 1,000 different things you have to learn, all those books you have to read just to kind of get caught up. And this also changes the audience. So I kind of divide the audience into kind of two camps, and neither camp is better than the other. They're just different. They have different needs. And that is builders versus innovators. So if you're an innovator, in the early days, it was innovators who came to be part of the agile scene. They saw that something was going on here. And they didn't quite know what it was, but they were trying to figure it out. And they got together with like-minded people. They tried new things. They took risks on things that might have blown up spectacularly and things that just didn't work out. And they were okay taking those risks and trying things because they wanted to be a part of what was going on. And they wanted to try the latest bleeding edge thing and see if it would help them. And this is great, of course, at the beginning, but as your audiences change, it introduces more people. And not every one of the people in that new audience, especially that larger audience, is part of that kind of innovator group. Some of them are what I consider part of the builder group. So a builder group wants to do good work, but they don't really care about Agile. So somebody who comes in and says, I want to be the best programmer in the world, if Agile is the best way to build software, that's what they want to learn. But they don't care about developing Agile, trying the new things in Agile. They just want to be the best software developer in the world. Or maybe I just want to build the best products and I want to know what's the best way to build products. Or I'm a startup and I'm like, I really care about my idea and I want my idea to succeed. And if Agile is the way to do that, then teach me this Agile stuff. So they want to be taught Agile as opposed to being part of growing and developing what Agile is. And again, there's nothing wrong with that, but it's a different audience. And so if you see on this chart, there's way more people that are coming in at the beginner side that are probably more likely to be builders, although there will be innovators in there as well. Um, but that's a larger chunk of the audience than the people on the far right, the very experienced, knowledgeable side. So if you're a user group, a meetup group, or a conference, well, no one's going to fault you if you start actually gearing your conference towards those beginner sessions, uh, towards those people trying to get them the basics and what do you need to actually be successful with this stuff. But of course, this leaves out a whole group of people who are there at the beginning who say, well, you know what? I really don't need another session on user stories and story splitting, or I don't need to do a planning poker session. I really don't care about that stuff. And it kind of changes your audience as you go along. So when we think of Agile as a movement, it's interesting because there's been a lot of research on movements and how they work. And I like to think of Agile in the context of social movements because social movements have four distinct stages. So we have emergence, coalescence, bureaucratization and formalization, and we have decline and institutionalization. Let's break those down and see how that kind of applies to where we are with Agile. So, first, emergence. This is the early days. This is when we're starting to figure out there's a problem, but we don't quite know what the solution is, and we're not quite sure how to articulate it. So, agile, as we understand, it comes as this backlash to this kind of waterfall way of working. Now, it wasn't really called waterfall then. I mean, this was just basically the way you build software if you're a professional company. That's how it was considered at the time. And I remember working for some small companies. I love working for small companies, and so many of them had ways of working that were very similar to agile, and yet they were rushing to try to get to a waterfall process because that's what professional companies do. So if you wanted to be looked at as a professional company, well, you had to have this phased approach of gather all the requirements, get the sign off, do the design documents, get the sign off, hand it off to development, hand it off to test, all that sort of stuff. That was what it was considered to be a professional organization. And the problem is, of course, this generates its own kind of frustrations and problems. Things like you get those big crunch deadlines, you get all those overtime hours, you get teams burning out after large projects, and there was a lot of dislike and frustration amongst the developer community about working in this way. It just didn't seem like a good way to work. It didn't seem sustainable. But we had to find a better way. And if we remember, Agile didn't start out as Agile. It doesn't start in 2001. So originally, there was talk about these lightweight methods, was how they called them, before deciding, maybe that's not a great name. Nobody wants to be called a lightweight, so we'll call it Agile. But before that, there was already experiments going on to try to find these better ways of working. And so what happened was a bunch of these contributors kind of self-organized. They tried their own thing in their own businesses and their own companies, and they shared them with each other. They said, "Hey, here's what we're doing. Here's a blog post on this. Here's a post to a mailing list on that, or something in a forum." And say, "Why don't you try it out?" And they'll say, "I tried it out and it didn't work for me. I wonder why. What was different about your context than my context?" So we recognize that Agile was this do-it-yourself approach. Again, going back to that, we are uncovering better ways of developing software by doing it and helping others to do it. So this means we tried different things and we took risks. That means we did things like test-driven development, pair programming. We didn't know if those things were going to work. Continuous integration. Like one of the fascinating things about continuous integration is like you can find writings about the concept of continuation long before there was any continuous integration software. So the software didn't exist, but wouldn't it be great if it did? And if it did, it would work like this. And they would try and do it manually. And then as it worked, then the software came to support it. And it's like that's fascinating that there was this thought that went into it and trying it by hand and building it out. And of course, you see things like Scrum, XP, Crystal, the SDM that all come out of this. So after you kind of have this experimental phase of we're just trying a bunch of stuff and we have these problems, trying to figure out how to identify and talk about these problems, we enter coalescence. So as we coalesce, as I mentioned, we have these pre-existing approaches to doing things. We figure out, well, what do we have in common? Is there some commonality between us, an umbrella that we can unite under? And it turns out there is. In 2001, we get the Manifesto for Agile Software Development. And this is a really interesting time because, again, now it has some clarity. This is what we are for, and this is what we are against. This is what we are not supporting. This is what we want to change from. So I want to point out and stop for a moment here and point out this type of success is really rare. It's really rare for this to actually work out. You can Google and find thousands of different software manifestos, different software approaches that people tried to make successful that all failed. But for some reason, in 2001, it was the right people in the right place at the right time, and it actually took off. And that's really rare. And you have to recognize that that's sort of special thing doesn't come along all the time. In fact, since 2001, there hasn't been something breathtakingly new that has usurped it yet. That hasn't happened. So what happens, of course, as we coalesce into this, and as that manifesto gets published, well, all new people, like me when I showed up, we have questions. We're trying to understand this stuff. What is Agile? What makes a team agile? What is Scrum? What is extreme programming? I need answers to these questions. And that leads us into the next phase, which is bureaucratization and formalization. Because in order to answer those questions, we have to solidify some things. It can't all be fluid at this point. We have to be able to answer those questions. So as you do this, though, in your movement, your edgier bits get sanded down because we have to decide what it is and what it isn't if we want to actually appeal to the mainstream. Like I remember for it's felt like years there were people complaining about extreme programming. You can't do extreme programming because the word extreme will be off-putting to your boss. So we won't do extreme programming. We'll just do Scrum and kind of do extreme programming things in there, and we just won't tell anybody. Things like that would happen because again, you had to make it more palatable to the mainstream. And of course, as the mainstream starts to adopt it, well, it gets reproduced. And for those of you in the audience who recognize video cassettes, and there may be some that have never seen those before, which makes me sad, and audio cassettes, you may recognize that as we duplicate these things, we lose fidelity, the quality degrades. So as people started to copy other Agile teams or other Scrum teams or other XP teams, they copied a lot of the practices, but they didn't understand why they were doing the practices. And so they couldn't tell, are they getting success by luck or are they failing by luck? Or is there something different about their context? And as it gets reproduced, though, it also constrains what is allowed. So, if this team is a Scrum team and we copied them, and you're a Scrum team, but you're doing something different, well, that's not Scrum. And there were a lot of those debates. That was probably about 5 or 6 years ago, I think. We started to have the debates about what is or isn't. That's not real Scrum, or you're not doing real Scrum, or Scrum butt, and all those sorts of things used to be the talk of the town. And that's what's happening at this phase of the movement. Is as we are coalescing and formalizing things, then what is in and what is out is becoming more clear. But the problem with this, of course, is then your movement becomes codified. It is what it is. So we see things like Scrum.org come out, the Scrum Alliance, Scrum Guide, Lean Kanban University. All these things come out to solidify, well, wait, this is what we're talking about. All those other things are not this. Otherwise, there might create confusion and we don't know what we're talking about as we try to reach a larger audience. So this is a necessary thing in a movement. It has to happen if you want to actually get mainstream adoption. The problem again is that you start to lose that do it yourself edge because this is what it is. Then, if you are doing this, this is what you must do, right? If this is Scrum and this is what Scrum says to do, then you must do what Scrum does or you're not doing Scrum. Well, if you're one of those people that says, well, we're trying to solve problems and do things differently, then, maybe some of those Scrum things help, but maybe we want to try some different stuff. But that's not necessarily going to be welcome. So those risk takers who are trying to do different things get pushed out. And if you've been following, kind of agile thinking, I guess, or agile thinkers on Twitter, you'll notice over the last few years, what you see is kind of new ideas that challenge the existing agile kind of approach to things often meet a lot of resistance. Whereas, back around, 2001, 2005, somewhere around there, new ideas would be welcomed with open arms. Well, now not so much because we're at a different phase in the movement. And in the end, of course, it gets commercialized. Again, this is not a bad thing. This is a simple statement of fact that happens because as you kind of grow in your movement and you want to reach that more mainstream audience, your audience changes and they're looking for something different. They're not, the risky, bleeding edge type people anymore. It's now, your big organizations, your governments, your banks, and they don't want all that risk. They want something that is very easy for them to digest. And so there is a market for that, and then the market gets filled as SAFe is successfully done. So then we enter decline and institutionalization, or as Eric Hoffer says, every great cause begins as a movement, becomes a business, and eventually degenerates into a racket. And that's how it kind of goes. It's a little cynical, but that's kind of his summary of it. Now, movements decline, and they all decline, and they all decline in different ways. And that's not necessarily a failure of the movement. That's just natural. So sometimes it's repression, and repression is obvious. That's just you just get shot down. And this happened to a lot of people who were doing agile in early organizations. They wanted to try it out, got to try it out for a bit, and then management said no, and that was the end of it. No, but we'll dig a little bit deeper into these next four ones up here. So we have organizational failure, success, so that's a good thing, co-optation, and establishment within mainstream society. So let's kind of see how agile does against this benchmark right now. So organizational failure. So the problem with this is we encounter the everything is agile problem. So this goes back to if anyone's read Jerry Weinberg, his law of raspberry jam, which is the thinner you spread it, the thinner it gets. And we see this in the everything is agile problem. We now have agile HR, agile marketing, agile business, agile this and that, agile coffee maker. I don't know, agile everything these days. And the problem with that is um, we no longer have a common understanding of what we're talking about. When we used to talk about agile, we kind of knew we were talking about software. And now maybe not. And yes, the ideas of agile are not necessarily limited to software, but when we thin out the term so much, it makes it hard to actually know what we're communicating. The communication becomes a little muddied. So we can have co-optation, and we can ask, well, has agile been co-opted in any way? So the question I was asked for that is, where did all the developers go? So when I talk about this at conferences, I get a show of hands for the developers, and every time there's less and less developers there. So what was a practitioner-led movement with a large quantity of developers now has a dwindling number of developers. Whereas Chris Metz said, as quoted by Liz Keogh here, I'm an engineering performance coach because Agile is toxic, so we don't talk about that anymore. And that's kind of a lot of the perspective, a lot of people in development, people who, again, were originally the people who were advocating for this movement are now not feeling quite as welcome. Then we can hit establishment within mainstream society. And I don't think you get more mainstream than when you're on the cover of Harvard Business Review. So I think we can definitely say that Agile has hit the mainstream. And again, this is not necessarily a bad thing. It's just a statement of the reality, the gravity of where we are. And we have to recognize where we are. So Agile is now mainstream. So this means the revolution has become the orthodoxy. It's no longer waterfall. Waterfall is no longer the default. Agile, if you're somebody starting a company today, they're not starting a waterfall company today. They're probably starting with some type of Agile as their default. So the revolution has become the orthodoxy, and that means Agile has become the orthodoxy. Or, for Star Wars fans that don't recognize Monty Python, Agile has become the empire. And again, success, right? That's amazing success for a movement to actually reach that level. However, empires are ripe for disruption. So consider yourself disrupted because this really changes things, right? So one thing we have to remember, for those of you who are there, you will remember this. For others, I'll remind you that Agile actually originally killed the remote work movement. There was a movement back in the early 2000s for remote work. It was really hot. Companies wanted to get rid of a lot of office buildings. Office space was expensive, and people were interested in working from home and having flexibility. And so a lot of companies were trying to encourage remote work. And it wasn't going very well. And there's a lot of reasons why it wasn't going very well, separate from Agile. Most of it around, organizations hadn't actually fully committed to, well, do we have to adjust how we work based on working remotely? The thought was we could keep everything the same and everyone would just dial in to, a phone meeting and somehow that conference call would work. And the answer is no, it doesn't work that way. And most of you probably know that by now. And also a lot of the technology wasn't there at the time. We didn't have things like Zoom. We didn't have a lot of collaboration tools that we have today. So it was struggling. It was struggling a lot to actually have success with remote work. But then Agile comes along, and a whole bunch of people in the Agile sphere were saying, "Hey, how about face-to-face communication? How about we try that? How about getting people together in team rooms? How about we put a bunch of stickies on the wall so we can really visualize the work?" And it turns out that companies got a lot of benefit out of this. And they also realized, well, it's pretty difficult when you have a lot of remote people. So a lot of companies started shifting from remote work to bringing people back in the office. And so Agile is kind of the final nail in the coffin of that remote work movement. But again, that doesn't mean that movements don't come back. So obviously now we see Zoom stock price doing quite well. This is actually an old screenshot from April. It's actually around 2:30 today, though it's been down the last few days if you've been following the stock market. But clearly, we're on Zoom right now, and they seem to be doing fairly well for themselves. And the reason, of course, is well, now we kind of have to do this sort of remote stuff. Now, the fascinating thing for me was that as soon as this whole COVID thing hit and everybody had to lock down, suddenly, like a week later, every Agile expert is a remote expert, which I found fascinating. Again, for people that were talking about team rooms and stickies on walls and face to face conversation, within a week they were remote experts. And of course, my response to that is, I don't believe you. I don't believe you. And I don't believe anybody is a remote expert at the moment right now. I think what we've seen is there are some organizations who have been doing remote work for a while and have found things that work for them in their context, but it hasn't gone through the same rigor that Agile kind of went through, where we have over time sharing ideas and seeing if we can reproduce a lot of that across multiple organizations. We haven't gotten to that point yet. And it's important that we start looking at that and start trying to do that stuff now, because now we have to make it work. And that's the difference between now and the previous remote movement is, it was kind of a, we could kind of half-heartedly go into it and say, sure, maybe you can work from home Tuesdays and Thursdays. And, maybe half the team will work from home and some people will be in the office, which is the worst situation you could possibly do. But now we have to do it. We don't have a choice. And so that means we actually have to put in effort to actually make it succeed. So we also, as we do this, we discovered that there's some challenges. We have challenges with this. So you see an article like this one, the reason Zoom calls drain your energy. So that's something we're discovering. We're discovering problems that we didn't know existed, and now we have to find solutions for them. So we have to recognize, again, that reality that the world has changed forever. That means that even if by some miracle coronavirus were to go away tomorrow, which would be awesome, and I'm totally on board for that happening. But even if it did, things are different. Everybody's mindset is different. We've adapted to this way of working, and we're trying to figure things out. And it's not going to be, oh, well, let's just flip the switch and go back. That's not going to happen. Of course, we're not sure yet exactly how it's changed or how it's permanently going to change things. We have no idea. There's nobody who has all the answers here. But we have to recognize gravity. So, what's some of the new reality that we have to recognize? Well, one, this means Jira wins, at least for now. And I know a lot of people in the Agile space have been very critical of Jira. Other tools, not just Jira, that just happens to be the one that is probably the most popular. But those kind of online tools for sharing information, well, you kind of have to deal with them now. And hopefully, that now that we kind of have this remote by default currently happening, there's a lot of companies that are putting a lot of effort into developing new tools, because we're going to need some new tools in order to be really successful at this in the long term. And maybe that ends up being Jira modifying down the road or another tool, who knows. But for the time being, you're going to have to learn to deal with Jira. There will also be more remote teams. So again, even if coronavirus goes away tomorrow, there's a lot of teams that aren't going to want to come back. And so you have to be ready for a work environment that has more remote teams. And we're going to figure out a lot of interesting things. So working from home, some people love it. They say, hey, I love working from home and I never want to go back to the office. Okay, well, that's interesting. Some people hate it. They hate the isolation. They hate the distractions of being at home. They're really looking forward to seeing their work friends again in the office. So what are you going to do as an organization when things open up again? And you have some people that say, I don't want to come back, and some people that are itching to get back. I mean, you could say, well, hey, we're just going to stay all remote now, except you might risk alienating and losing some of those employees that would rather work in an office environment. Or you might say, hey, well, let's all come back to our Agile team rooms and stickies on the wall. And you might lose some employees who say, I'm going to find a place where I can work remotely because I like that way better. So, maybe you end up saying, we're going to have some remote teams and some on-site teams. Maybe that'll work out for you. Now, the worst possible thing that we could possibly see is where some people on the team work from home and some people on the team are in the office. That's probably going to be the biggest disaster, and I hope we don't see some of that. But of course, if we don't do that, and you have a team that already exists today that decides half of them want to come in and half of them want to stay home, you may have to restructure that team because that just may not work. So you may have to start thinking about these things now, because that's going to be coming. And as an organization, you have to think about how are our teams going to be structured going forward. So how do we respond to this change? So I think one of the most important things we have to do here is we have to remember, what are the things we learned from Agile, separate from the practices? What are the concepts, or as I call them, the aspects of Agile that we've learned? So remember, we're uncovering better ways. So we have to go back to uncovering better ways of developing software by doing it and helping others to do it. So how do we uncover better ways? Well, we take what we know and we start to say, what are better ways of doing that, of achieving that concept or that aspect? So here are the four aspects of Agile as I've kind of coined them here. We've learned things about seeing the work, understanding the work, moving the work, and crafting the work. Let's break that down one at a time here. So, seeing the work. How did we learn about seeing the work? Well, we learned transparency is super important. So, we need to know what is going on at any point in time in the organization, who's kind of working on what, how does that relate to what we're trying to achieve here. Before, a lot of this used to be compartmentalized back in the waterfall days. It was a need to know basis. But in Agile, we learned we needed that transparency to understand the problems we're trying to solve. So, in order to solve that problem, we looked at how we make the work visible. And we still have to solve this problem. A lot of the ways we solve this problem was, again, by putting stickies up on the wall, but that may not be practical. So if you're dealing in a remote work environment, how are you going to make the work visible? And just stashing it in Jira doesn't actually work, right? If nobody actually looks at it, it's not really visible. So you have to figure out what are going to be the new ways that we're going to make that work visible. And if we see all the work, then of course we have to prioritize the work. Because if we can't prioritize the work, we don't know what's coming next. It's just a pile of stuff, a bunch of items in Jira, right? And that's not going to help us at all. So again, regardless of what practices we use to do it, we have to make sure we're still prioritizing the work. And we have to recognize one of the things we learned was it's not done until we're all done. So it's not, hey, I wrote these requirements documents, I throw them over the wall and it's done. In Agile, we learned, we need to see that thing all the way through to the end till it gets into a customer's hands. We need to recognize that, hey, if there's a bottleneck somewhere, maybe I can help out with that and answer some questions instead of going to start some other new work. So by having that transparency, having that work visible, knowing its priority, and then knowing that it's not done till it's done, that is the stuff that we're going to have to focus on. And again, having that focus and that shared vision to understand, well, why are we doing these things anyways? What's our goal in doing this? What are we actually trying to accomplish? So let's look at understanding the work. So we recognize now that you won't get it right the first time. We used to. I know this is weird for people who are kind of like new. There were years at a time where people were convinced that if we just gathered all the requirements, if we just got the sign off, then we would absolutely get it right the first time and it would absolutely deliver on time. Um, and we were super wrong. And so now we recognize you won't get it right the first time. We recognize that just because you think you have a great idea, if you build it, they probably won't come. So you need to actually test your ideas to make sure your customers actually want them, that it'll actually solve the problems that they have. So coming with that is in order to do that, then we have to be able to release early, release often. And we used to think that this was really scary. You didn't want to release often because things broke when you released. So you would release infrequently to have more stability, but it actually ended up causing more problems. So when we released early and we released often, two things happened. One, we got much better at releasing, so there were less problems with each release. And two, by releasing often, we actually got feedback and figured out, are we actually building the right thing? And if we're not, we had an opportunity to inspect and adapt. So we can actually inspect and adapt and learn from what we were building. So again, all these concepts, you'll notice I'm not talking about, having your backlog. I'm not talking about your sprint planning meeting. I'm not talking about your daily stand up or, having your boards on the wall. It's not about the practices. These are the concepts that we've learned. And we have to remember those concepts because we're going to have to build on those. So this includes things like validated learning, which we got from Lean Startup. That idea, build, measure, learn. The faster we can go around that loop of building something small, testing it out, learning from our customers, then the better off we're going to be. And tying in with that was the idea of the minimum viable product that way we could cut our losses quickly. So if we were building the wrong product, we wouldn't sink hundreds of thousands of dollars into it and months and months of work. We could cut those losses quickly and go double down on whatever is working. And this leads us to moving the work because we've learned things about how work moves through systems. So we've learned about flow and the importance of managing flow. And through doing that, we've learned that the best way to manage flow is to limit the amount of work that we have in progress. That is, if we start a whole bunch of things, it's going to slow us down. And the thing was, the old way of thinking was, hey, can we start another thing? Could we get a head start on this thing while this other thing's blocked? Rather than unblocking it, we'll just start a new thing. And then maybe we can do 5 streams at the same time or 6 streams at the same time. And now we've learned that that only makes you go slower. So you actually have to limit that work in process. So we want small releases. Small releases lowering our batch size. So that's going to help us again keep that flow going and recognizing where those bottlenecks are so we can address them. And this helps us get to value sooner. So again, that idea not just that we can learn from our customers, like we talked about in understanding the work, but also the fact that if this helps our customer, maybe it's not the full solution, maybe it's only 1/10 of the final solution that we're going to deliver. But if it makes our customers' lives a little bit better, maybe it's better to get that in their hands early so they can actually take advantage of that sooner. And so let's look at crafting the work. What did we learn about how we craft the work? Well, we learned about autonomy and the importance of that. That is, that the people who are doing the work are probably best equipped to decide how the work should be done. So they have the skills, they know how to do it. Let them decide how it's done. Now, of course, we also learned that this only works if they have that focus and clarity of vision to understand why are we doing this work. That way they can make decisions that are aligned with our vision while having the autonomy to know how to best implement it. We learned about the success of cross functional teams, about how we can remove delays by having everyone kind of that needs to be there close by and around each other, because this reduces handoffs. And so we reduce those delays and handoffs, and that we can become test driven. Now, some of this may seem obvious to you now, but I will tell you one company I worked for way back when I just joined the team, and they had a remote QA team that was working with them, that was working for another company. And first thing I asked them was, I said, "Well, can we see your test plans?" I said, "No, no, you can't see our test plans. Of course, you can't see our test plans. Why would you see our test plans? If you saw our test plans, you would make them pass." That's right. They were worried that if they gave us the test plans, that we would actually make their test plans pass. Because to them, success was if they found defects in the software, then they were doing their job. They were doing a good job if they could find ways to break our software. So they wanted to actually encourage us to not meet the requirements so that they could ding us later with that. And that's really weird, right? Because we now know, of course, if we have those tests, if we know how it's supposed to work, if we know the scenarios it's supposed to work in, if we test those first, it turns out that actually helps a lot in actually building quality software. And the other thing we've learned is, of course, that automation equals speed. That if you really want to go fast, you cannot do it without automation. So even if there is an upfront cost for it, you will have to pay that if your objective is to actually go very quickly. So again, we didn't talk about a lot of the practices. We didn't talk about individual practices that you necessarily do. These are concepts, these are aspects of Agile that we've learned. So now when you find yourself in a different environment, you have to ask yourself, those things that we know are true are still true, but those practices may no longer serve us. So if you are just applying Scrum practices to a completely different context, please, please just stop it. Just stop it. Because you may be doing yourself a large amount of harm. And this is the same thing as when remote work was kind of first movement, was people just assumed you could work the exact same way and just work on it in a remote environment and somehow it's magically going to work. It doesn't work that way. So you have to actually question your old practices, whether that's sprints or pair programming or mob programming or stand ups or retrospectives, story points, whatever. Whatever practice you're currently doing, you have to reevaluate it and say, is this actually helping us? What aspect of Agile does this actually support? And are we getting the benefit of that? Because if we're not, maybe we need to find another existing practice, or maybe we have to try some new stuff that might work given our current context. So, thinking about this, so here's an example of questioning old practices. Well, let's say you decided that you want to do mob programming, and you're doing mob programming, whether you're doing it remote or whether you're doing it on site, doesn't matter. But this is the idea that people are just um, working on one thing on one computer at a time. So the team is actually focused on trying to achieve one feature at a time. So you have to ask yourself, okay, if we're doing that, do we need sprints? Because sprints, what's the purpose of sprints? Well, sprints are a focus and constraint. It's a means of limiting the amount of work you have in progress. Because if you do, let's say, a 1 or 2 week sprint, you can only take on that much work. So now you're forced to limit the work in progress that you have. But if you're doing mob programming, everybody's working on one thing at a time. So you're already limiting your amount of work in progress. So do you need that focus and constraint of the sprint? And the answer might be yes. Maybe your team gets a benefit from that, and you say, hey, that's good. We still like it. We still like to see what's coming for the whole week or the whole 2 weeks, or maybe it ties into how we interact with our customers. Maybe there's still a good reason for it. but maybe there isn't. And if there isn't, then maybe you don't need that anymore. Likewise with stand-ups. Do you need a stand-up for that if everybody's working on the same thing? Maybe you do, maybe you don't, because maybe you see value in everybody kind of, first thing in, kind of recapping and figuring out what the plan of attack is for the day. Maybe there's value in that, or maybe you just feel like, hey, we're good. We jump right into it because we're all here anyways. But you have to ask the question. And I find a lot of organizations and a lot of teams, once they have these practices, they stop asking those questions. So here's the number one thing that I find most organizations don't do, and it's probably the most important thing that you need to do. And we'll talk about how this ties into the practices in a moment, but this is exactly the most important thing. If you haven't done this, once this webinar is over, you need to go and do this right now. And that is, you need to figure out, what is your organization optimized for? Because you can optimize your organization for all kinds of things. You can optimize for keeping people busy, making sure everybody's 100% utilized. You can optimize for shareholder value, short-term, quarterly reports. You can optimize for remote work because of our given situation. Maybe you want to optimize for that. You can optimize for team collaboration or customer delight, or making sure people can work on their specialties. Whatever it is, it's important that everyone in the organization understands, what are we optimizing for? And the reason why is because whatever you optimize for, there are going to be trade offs. And you have to recognize what those trade offs are. So, for example, keeping people busy. So now some of you may laugh at this, like, why would an organization optimize for keeping people busy? And yet, this is actually the default for most organizations. Our objective is to make sure that we've hired and paid these people. Their time is expensive. We need to make sure we keep them busy. But as we know, of one of the aspects we learned from Agile, that flow is super important. And guess what happens if everyone's 100% utilized? You can just picture a highway. I'm in Toronto, so like the Don Valley Parkway at 100% utilization, nobody's moving. So if everybody's super busy, then nothing is getting done. And yet, a lot of organizations are intentionally optimizing to keep people busy. I remember one organization I worked with. They had started doing Scrum, and we'd been working with them for a little while, and they were getting some really great results. They were improving their time to market. Things were flowing much better. Teams were much happier. There was much less burnout. And one day, the VP pulls me aside and says to me, he says, "I got a problem." I said, "Really? What's the problem?" He said, "I walk around, and you know what? People just don't feel busy. Like, I feel like they should be busier." And it's interesting, right? That gut instinct is there to feel like, wait, are people kind of slacking off? Is that what's happening here? What if we made them more busy? Without recognizing that the reason why they're getting the results they're getting is because there's slack in the system, is because people are more available to remove blockers and things like that. And that's how they were getting the results. And if they actually amped up keeping people busy, putting more on their plate, they'll actually slow down and lose the gains that they had gotten. So if we look at keeping people busy, let's talk about what some of the side effects are. So we keep people busy, make sure everybody's 100% utilized. So what happens? Well, now we have to have people that have to spend their time making sure that some people who are a little more specialists have work in their specialty that they can work on. For example, maybe you have database analysts, or security specialists, or whatever it is. Some people have more specialized roles, and maybe there's not a lot of work for them at a given time. And then you say, well, we got to find something for them to do. We have to keep them busy. Well, it takes somebody's time. That's going to make them more busy to find work for this person to do. But also, it's going to be a problem because guess what? Now that we found them work to do, there's very little work that only requires one role. So, regardless of what they do, when they do it, maybe they're going to need some front end work or some back end work, or they're going to need some testing. It's going to have to get tested. It's going to have to get released. So, guess what? All that is going to add more work to your system, and it's going to cause you to slow down. So, it's going to be a trade off. And if everyone's super busy and everybody's working on their specialties, what happens to team collaboration? Well, unless you do something, it's probably going to start going down. Because guess what? I'm busy with my stuff. You're busy with your stuff. We're doing our own thing. Why would we want to collaborate? I don't have time for that. That's the sort of thing that's going to happen. So you have to recognize, when you optimize for these things, there are going to be trade offs. And are you making intentional trade offs for what you want? And if there are side effects, are you going to do something to mitigate some of those side effects? Because that's going to take effort and energy as well. So we can look at something like remote work. So a lot of organizations now are saying, well, maybe we actually want to go full on remote work all the time. Okay, cool. That's something you can optimize for. But what do you have to take into consideration? Well, you can't just take your existing team that sat in a room together, throw them all remote, and expect collaboration to be the same, right? You're going to need things like certain tooling. You're going to need things that are going to help you with that. And if you don't have those things, you can expect it to go down. You might have an impact on things like customer delight, because if you were getting customer delight by going out and interacting with your customers and getting actual face-to-face time with them, getting the product in front of them, watching their reactions, well, if you don't have that, as you probably don't right now, if you're not taking effort to actually try and get something close to that to mitigate that, you're going to actually suffer in that dimension. So again, if you're going to be picking to optimize for one of these things, you have to be intentional about it. And that's not necessarily say don't do any of these things. You can optimize for any of these things. It's perfectly fine to. You just have to do it intentionally and understand what you're trading off and what you're going to do to mitigate some of those trade-offs. So, for example, we understand that open source projects, they're usually optimized differently than what you would expect in your business. That's obvious and that's natural, right? They optimize for a world where a contributor may show up one day and we may never see them again. They optimize for a world where people are across many different time zones, where there are not necessarily any working hours. So the design of how you work and how they interact with each other has to be vastly different. So you're going to see things like a lot more emphasis placed on documented things. Because guess what? If one of your main developers leaves and you don't have a bunch of stuff documented, it's going to be really hard for new contributors to come in and figure things out. And that's how a lot of open source projects, smaller ones, will end up failing, is because some significant contributor leaves and no one is capable of filling the void. So you have to think about, okay, well, how did they optimize for that scenario? And you probably don't want to do it for your business that way because it's a different context. But it also points out that it opens up new possibilities. So when we looked at remote work, sure, it may have an impact on team collaboration or customer delight, but it also opens a door. There's an opportunity here that you now have access to a larger talent pool, because now you can access people from all around the world and you can choose whether you want or not whether you want to access this talent pool within a certain time zone, so everyone's in the same time zone, or you want to do across different time zones. But the thing is, if you say we wanted to decide to optimize for remote work, then you also have to be prepared to say, I need to take advantage of what the strengths of optimizing for this are. Because if you optimize for remote work, but still just hire people from the same city, well, you're really kind of handicapping yourself there. And you could really have a challenge with that against your competitors who can then access developers, the best developers from around the world. So, again, I want to remind you, I don't have all the answers for this. I can't tell you what your organization should be optimized for. I can't tell you that. But what I can tell you is that these are the questions you need to ask right now in your organization. You have to know the answers to these things because the way you work has to complement the way you are trying to optimize your organization. So the practices you end up doing, again, supporting those agile aspects and supporting the way you want to optimize your organization. So thinking back to Agile here, when we think back to 2001, when all that time of uncertainty, when people were trying out all these different practices, did you ever think in 2001 it'd be really cool to have been there at that time when new practices were coming out? There'd be a random blog post that would change the game. You read that, you'd be like, wow, that's really cool. I want to do that. It'd be really cool to be part of trying those new ways of working. Well, if you ever thought that, I have good news for you. Now's your chance, because that's where we are. Because the world of work is in such flux, because we don't really have a handle on how to best do what we're doing now, there's an opportunity here to start and try those things and figure out those things. Because now that you know the aspects of Agile, you know the things we've learned from this, you understand the practices. Once you understand the rules, you get to break the rules because you do it supporting the aspects, recognizing reality instead of trying to fight against it. And you say, hey, what if we tried something different that understood the reality but could help us out? And I'm going to give you permission to break all the rules. So if your organization says you're not allowed to do that because that's not Scrum, well, you can say Todd gave you permission. They won't know who I am, but you can tell them anyways and say, well, he gave a talk. That sounds authoritative. Why not? So I give you permission. You can break all the rules because we have to bring back this do-it-yourself ethic, because that has to come back, because we don't have a choice, because nobody knows the answers. So here's my challenge for you. One, right now, or tomorrow, as soon as possible, find out what your organization is optimized for. Start to have those conversations. Make sure everybody's on the same page. What are we actually optimizing for right now? Then, once you understand what you're optimized for, examine your practices and see what makes sense for your chosen optimizations. Again, if you're optimizing for remote work, then maybe you say, okay, we're really going to optimize for that. Are we going to start looking at hiring people who are, further away than our normal offices? And then three, the important part, the part that kind of really generates the movement, is share your results. Start building communities around this. You can share them with me, share them with other people who are here, share them with other organizations that you're close with. Again, and sharing those ideas together, find better ways of developing software. Going back to the Agile Manifesto there. So what I'd like you to do is when you do that, come through there. You can send it off to me in an email if you got it. I'd love to hear what you've decided to optimize for, how you've examined your practices and how that's changed. And of course, like everyone else, I'm helping out organizations remotely now. So wherever you are, obviously I can now help you out. So you can contact me if you want help figuring out what you're optimized for or how to look at your practices. Other than that, thank you very much. And I think we can move to some questions.